Jake Morrison woke up before sunrise like he did every morning on New Terra. The air smelled clean and fresh, nothing like the polluted cities back on Earth. He stretched his arms and got out of bed, pulling on his worn work clothes and heavy boots. His small farmhouse was quiet and simple, just the way he liked it. There were no fancy machines or loud noises here, only the soft sounds of animals waking up outside and the gentle wind blowing through the fields. He walked to his kitchen and made himself a simple breakfast of bread and eggs from his own chickens. The eggs tasted better than anything he remembered from Earth. Everything here tasted better because it was real and natural. Jake ate slowly, looking out the window at his fields. The crops were growing well this season. He had planted corn, wheat, and several types of vegetables. The work was hard, but it made him feel peaceful inside. After breakfast, Jake went outside to feed the animals. He had chickens, 3 cows, and a few goats. The animals knew him and came running when they saw him. He talked to them softly while he worked, telling them about his plans for the day. Some people in the colony thought he was strange for talking to animals, but Jake didn't care. The animals listened better than most people anyway. New Terra was a small colony world on the edge of human space. About 200 people lived here, all of them wanting to escape the wars and chaos that filled the rest of human territory. Most of the colonists were farmers, teachers, or artists. They were peaceful people who believed in living simple lives close to nature. They had left Earth and the other crowded worlds behind to find something better. Jake had come here 5 years ago. He never talked about why he left Earth or what he was running from. Some people whispered that he was a coward who ran away from military service. Others thought he had lost his family in one of the wars. The truth was somewhere in between, but Jake kept it to himself. He didn't like talking about the past. The past was full of loud noises, angry voices, and too many people telling him what to do. The morning passed quietly as Jake worked in his fields. He checked each plant carefully, pulling out weeds and making sure the soil had enough water. Farming required patience and attention. You couldn't rush plants to grow faster. You had to work with nature's timing, not against it. This was something Jake understood deeply. He had learned that forcing things to happen only made them break. Around midday, his neighbor Ben walked over from the next farm. Ben was an old man with white hair and a kind face. He was one of the few people Jake actually enjoyed talking to. Ben never asked too many questions, and he never pushed Jake to be someone he wasn't. They sat together under a tree and shared lunch. Ben had brought fresh bread and some cheese. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, just listening to the birds and watching the clouds move across the sky. Finally, Ben spoke up. His voice was soft and friendly. He said the Colony Council was having a meeting tonight. They wanted to discuss the future of New Terra and whether they should start trading with other worlds. Jake felt his stomach tighten. He didn't like meetings. Too many people in one room, all talking at once and disagreeing about everything. Ben noticed Jake's uncomfortable expression and smiled. He said Jake didn't have to go if he didn't want to. Nobody would force him. But Ben thought it might be good for Jake to hear what was being discussed. Changes were coming to the colony whether they liked it or not. The universe was getting smaller, and even peaceful places like New Terra couldn't stay isolated forever. Jake nodded slowly but didn't promise anything. He would think about it. Maybe he would go, maybe he wouldn't. Ben patted him on the shoulder and stood up to leave. He said he would save a seat for Jake just in case. Then he walked back toward his own farm, moving slowly like he had all the time in the world. The afternoon was hot, and Jake spent it working on his irrigation system. One of the pipes had a small leak and water was being wasted. He got his tools and fixed it carefully, making sure everything was tight and secure. This kind of work made him happy. It was simple and clear. You found a problem and you fixed it. There was no confusion or arguing about the right way to do things. As the sun started to set, Jake finished his work and cleaned up his tools. He fed the animals their evening meal and locked the barn doors. The sky turned orange and purple, beautiful colors that made him stop and stare. Sunsets on New Terra were different from Earth. The light seemed softer somehow, more gentle on the eyes. Jake thought about the meeting Ben had mentioned. Part of him wanted to stay home and avoid the crowds, but another part of him, a small quiet voice in his head, said he should go. Maybe Ben was right. Maybe he should know what was happening in the colony. He couldn't hide forever. He went inside and washed up, changing into cleaner clothes. Then he stood by the door for a long moment, building up his courage. Going to the meeting felt like facing a small battle. His hands shook slightly and his heart beat faster. But he reminded himself that these were his neighbors, not enemies. They were peaceful people just like him. Jake took a deep breath and stepped outside. The meeting hall was only a 10-minute walk from his farm. He could see other colonists heading in the same direction, talking and laughing with each other. He walked alone, keeping some distance behind the others. When he reached the hall, he paused at the door. Through the windows, he could see the room was already full of people. Ben saw him and waved, pointing to an empty seat he had saved. Jake pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room went quiet for just a moment as people noticed him. Then everyone went back to their conversations. Jake walked quickly to the seat next to Ben and sat down, trying to make himself small and invisible. Ben smiled at him with approval. The colony leader stood up at the front of the room and called for everyone's attention. The meeting was about to begin, and Jake had no idea how much his quiet life was about to change. The colony leader, a woman named Margaret Ford, stood at the front of the meeting hall with a worried expression on her face. She cleared her throat and asked for complete silence. The room quieted down immediately. Everyone could sense that something important was about to be announced. Margaret looked tired, like she hadn't slept well in days. She began speaking in a serious tone that made everyone lean forward in their seats. She said that 3 days ago the colony had received a message from an approaching spacecraft. The ship belonged to the Apache Nation, one of the most powerful military groups in human space. They were coming to New Terra and would arrive within a week. The room exploded with worried voices. People started talking over each other, asking questions and expressing fears. Jake felt his chest tighten. He knew about the Apache Nation. Everyone did. They were legendary warriors, descendants of Earth's native peoples who had formed their own civilization among the stars. Margaret raised her hands and called for quiet again. She explained that the Apache had sent peaceful greetings. They wanted to establish a trading post on New Terra. They offered protection in exchange for food supplies and a place to rest their ships. The Apache commander had assured them that no harm would come to the colony. They simply wanted a mutually beneficial relationship, but the colonists were scared. They had come to New Terra to escape military cultures and warfare. Now warriors were coming right to their doorstep. One man stood up and said they should refuse the Apache request. Another woman argued that refusing might anger the warriors and bring trouble. A heated debate began with people shouting their opinions across the room. Jake sat quietly through all of this, feeling more and more uncomfortable. He hated conflict and loud arguments. Ben leaned over and whispered that maybe the Apache weren't as bad as people feared. Maybe they really did just want trade and friendship. Jake wanted to believe that, but he had seen enough of military people to be wary. Soldiers and warriors brought violence with them even when they meant well. The meeting lasted for 3 more hours. Finally, the Colony Council voted to accept the Apache proposal. They didn't really have a choice. Refusing might be seen as an insult, and New Terra had no defenses. If the Apache wanted to take the planet by force, there was nothing the colonists could do to stop them. At least this way they might gain some protection and valuable trade. Jake left the meeting as soon as it ended, walking quickly back to his farm in the darkness. He didn't want to talk to anyone about what had just happened. His mind was full of worries and old memories he tried to keep buried. The stars above seemed colder than usual. The peaceful life he had built here suddenly felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. The next week passed slowly. Jake threw himself into his work, trying not to think about the coming Apache ship. He repaired fences, planted new seeds, and spent extra time with his animals. But he couldn't completely ignore what was happening. The whole colony was preparing for the arrival. People cleaned up the main street, organized supplies for trade, and practiced what they would say to the warriors. On the 7th day, the Apache warship appeared in the sky. It was massive and dark, covered in tribal markings that glowed with a faint red light. The ship moved silently through the atmosphere and landed in the open field near the colony center. The ground shook from its weight. Every colonist came out to watch, standing in nervous groups and whispering to each other. A door opened on the side of the ship and a ramp extended down to the ground. Apache warriors began walking out in organized lines. They wore armor that mixed advanced technology with traditional designs. Feathers and beads decorated their gear alongside weapons and communication devices. Each warrior moved with absolute confidence and discipline. These were people who had been trained for combat since childhood. Jake watched from the back of the crowd, trying to stay unnoticed. He counted about 50 warriors coming out of the ship. They formed neat rows in front of their vessel and stood at attention. Then a figure appeared at the top of the ramp that made everyone go silent. She was tall and powerful, wearing more elaborate armor than the others. Her long black hair was tied back and her face showed the marks of many battles. This was clearly their commander. She walked down the ramp slowly, taking in the sight of the colony and its people. Her eyes were sharp and missed nothing. When she reached the bottom, Margaret Ford stepped forward to greet her. Margaret looked small and fragile next to the warrior woman. They spoke briefly, and then the Apache commander raised her voice so everyone could hear. She introduced herself as Commander Kaya Blackthorn of the Apache Nation. She said her people came in peace and honor. They respected New Terra's desire for a quiet life and would not interfere with the colony's ways. All they asked for was a place to establish a trading post and rest station. In return, they would protect New Terra from pirates and raiders. They would also share technology and knowledge that could help the colony prosper. Kaya spoke with absolute authority, but there was no cruelty in her voice. She sounded honest and direct. Jake found himself listening carefully to her words. She wasn't like the military officers he remembered from Earth. There was something different about her, something he couldn't quite identify. Margaret accepted the proposal formally and invited Kaya to a welcome dinner that evening. The Apache warriors began unloading supplies from their ship while the colonists slowly returned to their daily activities. People talked excitedly about the warriors, some frightened and others curious. Jake walked back to his farm feeling confused. The Apache seemed honorable, but he still didn't trust military cultures. That evening, Margaret asked several colonists to help prepare and serve the welcome dinner. Jake tried to refuse, but Ben volunteered him before he could say no. Ben said it would be good for Jake to see the Apache up close. Maybe it would help him overcome his fears. Jake wanted to argue, but he knew Ben was just trying to help. So he agreed reluctantly. The dinner was held in the colony's largest building. Tables were arranged in a square and decorated with flowers and candles. Apache warriors sat on one side while colony leaders sat on the other. Jake and a few other colonists were assigned to bring out food and keep glasses filled. It was the perfect job for Jake because he could stay busy and avoid talking. As he moved around the room carrying plates, Jake tried not to make eye contact with anyone. But he couldn't help noticing Kaya. She sat at the center of the Apache side, speaking with Margaret about trade agreements. Her voice was calm and measured. She asked intelligent questions about the colony's crops and resources. She seemed genuinely interested in what New Terra had to offer. At one point, Jake was pouring water into glasses near where Kaya sat. His hands trembled slightly from nervousness, and he focused hard on not spilling anything. Suddenly, he felt eyes on him. He glanced up and found Kaya staring directly at him. Her gaze was intense and curious. Jake quickly looked away and moved to the next glass. His heart pounded in his chest. Why had she been looking at him like that? He was nobody important, just a farmer helping serve dinner. He finished his task and hurried back to the kitchen area. Through the doorway, he could still see Kaya. She had returned to her conversation, but every few minutes her eyes would drift around the room. Once or twice, Jake thought she looked toward the kitchen where he was standing. He told himself he was imagining things. There was no reason for an Apache commander to notice him. The dinner ended late, and Jake walked home in the darkness, feeling exhausted. His quiet life had just become much more complicated, and he didn't know how to feel about it. 3 weeks passed after the Apache arrived on New Terra. The warriors kept their word and behaved respectfully toward the colonists. They built their trading post on the edge of town, a simple structure that blended surprisingly well with the colony's peaceful aesthetic. Some colonists slowly began to relax around the Apache presence. Others, like Jake, remained wary and kept their distance as much as possible. Jake returned to his normal routine of farming and caring for his animals. He rarely went into town unless necessary. On the occasions when he did need supplies, he planned his trips carefully to avoid times when Apache warriors might be shopping at the same stores. He had nothing against them personally, but their presence reminded him too much of a life he had left behind. A life of duty, discipline, and violence. But avoiding them became harder as the weeks went on. The Apache warriors were curious about farming, and several of them started visiting the agricultural fields to learn. They asked questions about crop rotation, soil health, and animal husbandry. The colonists were surprised by this interest. They had expected warriors to only care about weapons and fighting. But the Apache explained that their people valued all skills, not just combat. A true warrior knew how to survive in any situation. One morning, Jake was working in his field when he noticed someone watching him from the road. He looked up and his heart jumped. It was Kaya Blackthorn. She stood there in simple clothes without her armor, but she still looked imposing and powerful. She was alone, which was unusual. Apache commanders usually traveled with guards. Jake quickly looked back down at his work, hoping she would move on, but instead he heard footsteps coming closer. She was walking into his field, heading directly toward him. Jake's mouth went dry. He had no idea what an Apache commander could possibly want from him. Maybe he had broken some rule he didn't know about. Maybe she was offended that he had been avoiding the Apache. Kaya stopped a few feet away and stood silently for a moment, watching him work. Jake kept his eyes on the ground, pulling weeds with shaking hands. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was deep and clear. She asked if he was Jake Morrison. He nodded without looking up. She introduced herself properly, even though everyone on New Terra already knew who she was. Then she said she had been observing him for the past 3 weeks. Jake's head snapped up in surprise. Observing him? Why would she do that? He was nobody special. Kaya's expression was serious but not angry. She explained that she had noticed him at the welcome dinner. Something about the way he moved and worked had caught her attention. So she had been watching him from a distance, studying his daily routines and how he interacted with his farm and animals. Jake felt uncomfortable and confused. He asked nervously what he had done wrong. Kaya shook her head. He had done nothing wrong. In fact, what she had observed impressed her greatly. She saw patience in him, a deep calmness that came from genuine peace rather than pretending. She saw gentleness in how he treated living things. She saw someone who understood the value of nurturing life rather than destroying it. She paused and then said something that made Jake's world stop. She said she wanted to bear his child. Jake stared at her with his mouth open, unable to form words. Surely he had misheard. Surely she couldn't have just said what he thought she said. But Kaya's face was completely serious. She waited calmly for his response. Jake finally found his voice and stammered that he didn't understand. He asked why she would want that. They didn't even know each other. Kaya nodded and said she would explain. She asked if they could sit down and talk properly. Jake looked around his field helplessly and then gestured toward a large tree that provided shade. They walked over and sat on the ground, several feet apart. Kaya began explaining Apache culture and traditions. She said her people believed strongly in genetic diversity and balance. Warriors were trained from childhood to be strong and fierce, but the Apache elders worried that their culture was becoming too focused on combat skills. They were losing other important traits like patience, nurturing, and the ability to create rather than destroy. The Apache had a tradition where warriors must choose partners who possessed traits they lacked. This wasn't about romance or marriage necessarily. It was about creating children who would inherit a balance of characteristics from both parents. Kaya had been searching for the right person for many years. She had met countless potential partners, but none of them felt right. They were either too similar to her or they possessed weaknesses rather than different strengths. Then she had come to New Terra and seen Jake. She watched how he worked with infinite patience. She saw his gentleness with animals and plants. She observed his deep connection to the earth and growing things. She noticed that other colonists considered him timid, but she saw something different. She saw someone who had chosen peace deliberately, Not because he was weak, but because he was wise enough to understand its value. Jake listened to all of this with growing panic. He shook his head and said he couldn't do what she was asking. He wasn't the right person. He was just a simple farmer who wanted to be left alone. Besides, he didn't want children. He had never even considered having a family. Kaya watched him carefully and asked why not. Was he afraid? The question hit Jake harder than he expected. He looked away and admitted quietly that yes, he was afraid. He was afraid of responsibility and afraid of bringing new life into a universe full of violence. He was afraid he would fail as a parent. He was afraid of everything, which is why he lived alone on the edge of nowhere. Kaya was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that fear was not weakness. Fear was natural and healthy. What mattered was what you did despite the fear. She said she had watched him closely enough to know he wasn't a coward. A coward would not work so hard to nurture life. A coward would not care so deeply about his animals and plants. Jake just valued different things than warriors did. Jake felt tears starting to form in his eyes and blinked them back quickly. He said he needed time to think. This was too much, too sudden. Kaya nodded and stood up. She said she understood and would give him space. But she hoped he would consider her request seriously. Before she left, she said one more thing. She said the universe needed both warriors and farmers. Her people had become too much like warriors. They needed the balance that someone like Jake could provide. Then she walked away, leaving Jake sitting alone under the tree. His mind was spinning, and his heart pounded. This was the strangest and most frightening thing that had ever happened to him. An Apache commander wanted him to father her child. It seemed impossible and absurd. Yet there had been absolute sincerity in Kaya's eyes. She had meant every word. Jake sat under that tree for hours, long after the sun had moved across the sky. His crops needed attention, but he couldn't make himself move. His whole world had just shifted in a way he didn't understand. The quiet, simple life he had built was no longer so simple. Someone had seen him, really seen him, and asked for something he didn't know how to give. As evening approached, Ben came walking over from his farm. He had noticed Jake sitting motionless and came to check on him. Jake looked up at his old friend with lost eyes and said that Kaya had visited him. Ben sat down next to him and asked what she wanted. Jake told him everything, his voice barely above a whisper. Ben listened without interrupting. When Jake finished, Ben was quiet for a while. Then he asked Jake a simple question. He asked what Jake was afraid would happen if he said yes. Jake thought about it and realized he was afraid of everything changing. He was afraid of losing his peace. He was afraid of failing someone who depended on him. He was afraid of becoming someone he didn't want to be. Ben nodded slowly and said those were reasonable fears. But then he asked another question. What was Jake afraid would happen if he said no? Jake hadn't thought about that. He considered it and realized he was afraid he would regret it. He was afraid he would spend the rest of his life wondering what might have been. He was afraid he would always remain hidden and small, never growing beyond his fears. Ben stood up and patted Jake on the shoulder. He said Jake didn't have to decide right now. He should take his time and really think about what he wanted from life. Then Ben walked back to his farm, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts again. The stars came out above, and Jake stared up at them, feeling more confused than he had ever felt in his entire life. 2 months had passed since Kaya first made her request. The seasons were changing on New Terra, and Jake's fields were preparing for harvest. The crops had grown tall and healthy, swaying in the autumn wind. Jake felt proud of his work this year. Everything had thrived despite his distracted mind. Or perhaps because of it, having someone to talk to regularly had given his days new rhythm and meaning. Kaya had become a regular presence at his farm. She visited almost every day now, sometimes to talk and other times to simply work alongside him in comfortable silence. The other colonists had grown used to seeing the Apache commander kneeling in the dirt, pulling weeds or feeding chickens. It was a strange sight, but somehow it felt natural. Kaya seemed more relaxed on the farm than she did anywhere else on New Terra. One morning, Kaya arrived earlier than usual. She asked if Jake would come visit the Apache compound. She wanted to show him something important. Jake felt nervous but agreed. He had never been inside the Apache living area before. It felt like crossing into foreign territory. But Kaya had spent so much time in his world. It seemed only fair that he visit hers. They walked together through the colony and past the trading post to where the Apache had built their living quarters. The buildings were simple but decorated with traditional designs and colors. Jake noticed that everything was kept extremely clean and organized. Warriors moved about with purpose, each one focused on their assigned tasks. When they saw Kaya, they stopped and saluted with fists over their hearts. She returned the gesture calmly. Kaya led Jake to a small garden behind one of the buildings. He stopped in surprise. Someone had created a beautiful space filled with plants native to Earth. There were herbs, flowers, and even a few small fruit trees. The garden was carefully maintained and clearly loved. Kaya explained that she had started this garden after their first conversations. She wanted to understand what drew him to growing things. Jake walked through the garden slowly, examining each plant. He could see that Kaya had researched proper techniques. Everything was healthy and thriving. He asked her questions about soil and water schedules. She answered with knowledge that showed genuine study and practice. Jake felt something warm spreading through his chest. This wasn't just a garden. It was Kaya's way of reaching toward his world. She was trying to understand him by learning what he loved. They sat on a bench in the garden and talked for hours. Kaya explained more about Apache philosophy. She said her people believed in balance in all things. Strength must be balanced with wisdom. Courage must be balanced with caution. The warrior spirit must be balanced with the peaceful spirit. For too long, the Apache had focused only on their warrior nature. They had grown powerful but unbalanced. That's why the elders sent warriors like Kaya to seek partners from different cultures. Jake asked if other Apache warriors were also seeking partners on other worlds. Kaya nodded. She said yes, it was part of a larger strategy to bring diversity back into their people. But each warrior had to find someone they truly respected and valued. It couldn't be forced or artificial. The children born from these unions would carry the best of both cultures forward. They would be the next generation's hope for balance. The weight of that responsibility scared Jake. He said he wasn't sure he could be someone's hope. He was just an ordinary person trying to live a quiet life. Kaya reached over and took his hand gently. It was the first time she had touched him beyond accidental brushes while working. Her hand was calloused and strong, but her grip was careful. She said that ordinary people doing their best were exactly what the universe needed. Not everyone could be extraordinary. Most of life was built on ordinary people making small good choices every day. Jake looked at their joined hands and felt his resistance crumbling. Over the past months, he had come to deeply respect Kaya. He admired her strength, but also her willingness to be vulnerable. She had shared her pain and fears with him. She had worked hard to understand his perspective. She had created a garden to speak his language. How could he not be moved by that? How could he not want to give her what she asked for? But there was still fear. He asked Kaya what would happen if they had a child together. Would she take the baby away to be raised as a warrior? Would Jake have any say in how the child was brought up? These questions had haunted him for weeks. Kaya's answer surprised him. She said that was something they would decide together. Apache tradition said both parents had equal voice in raising their children. She would never take a child from its father without his consent. She explained that many Apache children were raised by extended families and communities rather than just two parents. If Jake wanted to be involved in the child's life, he could be. If he preferred to step back and let Kaya raise the child within Apache culture, that was acceptable too. The choice would be his as much as hers. What mattered most was that the child would know both sides of their heritage. They would learn farming and peace from Jake's legacy. They would learn strength and honor from Kaya's legacy. Jake felt tears forming and didn't try to hide them this time. He said he wished he could be as brave as she thought he was. He wished he had the courage to say yes without fear. Kaya squeezed his hand and said courage wasn't the absence of fear. Courage was acting despite fear. She had seen him be courageous many times. Every day he chose to be gentle in a harsh universe was an act of courage. Every day he nurtured life instead of destroying it was a rebellion against violence. They sat in the garden as the sun moved across the sky. Eventually, Kaya had to return to her duties and Jake went back to his farm. But something had changed between them. The distance had shrunk. They weren't just two strangers from different worlds anymore. They were two people who had taken the time to truly see each other. That was rare and precious. Over the next few weeks, Jake found himself thinking more seriously about saying yes. He imagined what a child might be like, who inherited both his gentleness and Kaya's strength. He pictured teaching a little one how to plant seeds and care for animals. He wondered if Kaya would teach them Apache traditions and stories. The idea was terrifying, but also beautiful in a way he hadn't expected. Ben noticed the change in Jake and asked about it one evening. Jake admitted he was considering accepting Kaya's request. Ben smiled and said he thought that was good. He said Jake had been hiding from life for too long. This was a chance to do something meaningful, something bigger than just surviving. Jake asked what if he failed. What if he wasn't a good father? What if he messed everything up? Ben laughed gently and said every parent worried about that. Nobody was ready for children. You just did your best and hoped it was enough. The fact that Jake worried about being a good father meant he probably would be. People who didn't care never worried. Jake wanted to believe that, but the doubt remained. Still, the pull toward saying yes was growing stronger. He couldn't deny it any longer. One afternoon, Kaya came to the farm and helped Jake harvest vegetables. They worked side by side, filling baskets with tomatoes, peppers, and squash. The work was peaceful and satisfying. When they finished, they sat under Jake's favorite tree and shared a simple meal. The food tasted better when eaten with someone else. Jake had forgotten that during his years of isolation. After eating, they lay back in the grass and looked up at the clouds. Kaya pointed out shapes she saw in the cloud formations. Jake added his own observations. It was a silly, childish game, but it felt right. They talked about small things and laughed about nothing important. In that moment, Jake realized something crucial. He didn't just respect Kaya anymore. He genuinely cared about her. She had become his friend. Maybe more than a friend. He sat up and looked at her seriously. She sat up too, sensing the shift in mood. Jake took a deep breath and said he had been thinking about her request. He said he was still scared and full of doubts. But he wanted to try. He wanted to say yes. Kaya's face broke into the first real smile Jake had ever seen from her. It transformed her entire appearance, making her look younger and lighter. She asked if he was certain. He nodded, even though his hands were shaking. Kaya stood up and pulled Jake to his feet. She placed both hands on his shoulders and looked directly into his eyes. She thanked him and promised that she would honor his courage. She would make sure their child knew their father's goodness and gentleness. She would teach the child to value peace as much as strength. Jake felt the weight of the decision settling on him, but also a strange sense of rightness. This was scary, but it was also the first truly brave thing he had ever done. Life continued normally for several weeks after Jake agreed to Kaya's request. They spent more time together, building their understanding and connection. The colony gradually accepted their unusual partnership. Some people thought it was strange, but most wished them well. The Apache warriors treated Jake with more respect now that their commander had chosen him. He still felt uncomfortable around them, but less afraid. Jake had just finished his morning chores when Ben came running up the road toward his farm. The old man was out of breath and his face was pale with fear. He shouted for Jake to come quickly. Something terrible was happening. Jake dropped his tools and ran to meet Ben. His heart pounded as Ben gasped out the news. Ships had appeared in orbit. Raiders. Pirates who attacked peaceful colonies for supplies and slaves. They were coming down to New Terra right now. The two men rushed toward the colony center where people were gathering in panic. The Apache warship that normally protected the planet was away on patrol. It wouldn't return for at least 2 days. The small garrison of warriors that Kaya had left behind was scrambling to organize a defense, but they were badly outnumbered. Through telescopes, people could see multiple raider ships descending through the atmosphere. This was a full-scale attack. Kaya stood in the middle of the chaos trying to bring order. She shouted commands to her warriors while also trying to calm the terrified colonists. When she saw Jake, relief flashed across her face. She called him over and spoke quickly. The raiders would land within the hour. The Apache garrison would fight, but there were only 15 warriors against what looked like over 100 raiders. They needed every advantage they could get. She asked Jake if he knew the terrain around the colony well. He nodded. She asked if there were places where they could set up ambushes or traps. Jake's mind went blank with fear for a moment. Then training he didn't know he still remembered kicked in. His father had taught him basic tactics even though Jake had hated those lessons. He forced himself to think clearly. Yes, there were places. The creek bed to the east? the rocky hills to the north, the old mining tunnels west of town. Kaya listened intently and started forming a plan. She told her warriors to split into 3 groups. Each group would set up positions at the locations Jake described. They couldn't stop the raiders, but they could slow them down and make the attack costly. She turned to the colonists and asked who was willing to help. Most people looked away or backed up. They were peaceful farmers and artists, not fighters. They had no idea how to use weapons or engage in combat. Jake stood frozen, every instinct screaming at him to run and hide. This was exactly what he had fled from on Earth: violence and warfare and people dying. He could go back to his farm and lock the doors. He could wait it out in his cellar like he always did when things got dangerous. Nobody would blame him. Everyone knew he was the most timid person in the colony. But as he looked at the frightened faces around him, something shifted inside. These were his neighbors, his community. Ben, who had been kind to him. Margaret, who ran fair council meetings. The family with 3 children who always waved when they saw him. And there was Kaya, standing strong even though she was facing impossible odds. She would fight to protect this place even though it wasn't her home. She would risk her life for people she barely knew because that was what honor demanded. How could Jake run and hide while she stood and fought? How could he let fear control him again? Jake stepped forward before he could change his mind. His voice shook when he spoke, but he spoke anyway. He said he would help. He knew the farming equipment could be modified into weapons. The plasma cutters could burn through armor. The heavy machinery could be used to create barricades. He might not know how to fight, but he knew how to solve practical problems. Maybe that could be useful. Kaya's eyes widened slightly in surprise. Then she smiled and nodded. She immediately started giving orders, putting Jake in charge of organizing the defensive preparations. Jake felt like he was moving through a dream as he led a group of colonists to the equipment storage. His hands shook as he showed them how to detach plasma cutters from their mounts and rig them as portable weapons. He directed others to use tractors to drag heavy cargo containers into defensive positions around key buildings. Ben worked alongside him, following Jake's instructions without question. Other colonists gradually joined in once they saw Jake taking charge. If the timid farmer was brave enough to help, maybe they could be too. Within 30 minutes, they had created a crude but functional defense system. It wouldn't stop a determined assault, but it was better than nothing. The raider ships landed in the fields outside town with a roar of engines. Hatches opened and armed figures poured out. They were a mixed group of different species and backgrounds united only by greed and violence. They carried advanced weapons and wore mismatched armor. These weren't soldiers. They were criminals and thugs who preyed on the weak. Kaya's warriors opened fire from their hidden positions. The raiders weren't expecting resistance and several fell in the first volley, but they recovered quickly and started returning fire. The battle began in earnest. Explosions rocked the ground. Energy weapons lit up the sky. The sounds of combat were deafening and terrible. Jake crouched behind a barricade with a modified plasma cutter in his trembling hands. Several colonists huddled near him, looking to him for guidance even though he had no idea what he was doing. He could see raiders advancing toward their position. His throat was dry and his heart hammered against his ribs. Every cell in his body screamed at him to run. But he stayed. He had made a choice to stand, and he would keep that choice even if it killed him. The raiders reached the barricades and started climbing over. Jake activated his plasma cutter and swept it across the opening. The heat made the raiders stumble back with shouts of pain and anger. The colonists beside him fired their own makeshift weapons. They weren't skilled fighters, but their desperate defense bought time for Kaya's warriors to reposition. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes. Jake found himself doing things he never imagined possible. He coordinated the colonist defenders, calling out warnings and directing fire. He used his knowledge of the colony layout to guide people to safer positions. He even dragged a wounded warrior to cover while plasma bolts flew overhead. His actions weren't brave or heroic. They were simply necessary. People needed help, and he was there to provide it. But the raiders kept coming. They had too many numbers and too much firepower. Kaya's warriors fought magnificently, but they were being pushed back toward the colony center. Several warriors had fallen. The defensive line was collapsing. Jake could see the desperation in Kaya's face as she fought in the middle of the chaos. She was holding the central position, but raiders were flanking her on both sides. Jake made a decision that terrified him. He told the colonists to stay behind the barricades and keep firing to provide cover. Then he grabbed his plasma cutter and ran toward Kaya's position. Ben shouted for him to stop, but Jake didn't listen. He couldn't watch Kaya die while he hid. He just couldn't. Maybe this was stupid and suicidal. Maybe he would die accomplishing nothing. But he had to try. Raiders saw him running and turned their weapons toward him. Jake zigged and zagged, using every scrap of cover he could find. Somehow he made it to Kaya's position without getting hit. She saw him and her eyes went wide with shock and anger. She yelled at him to get back to safety. But before Jake could respond, more raiders appeared behind them, cutting off their retreat. They were surrounded. Kaya moved to stand back to back with Jake. She said something in her native language that might have been a prayer or a curse. Jake gripped his plasma cutter with white knuckles. His whole body shook with fear, but his hands were steady enough. The raiders advanced from all sides, closing the circle. This was it. This was where Jake would die. At least he wouldn't die hiding. At least he would die trying to protect someone he cared about. That had to count for something. Jake barely slept that night. He tossed and turned in his bed, his mind running through endless circles of worry and confusion. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Kaya's serious face asking for his child. The request seemed to come from a completely different universe than the one he lived in. Warriors and farmers had nothing in common. Their worlds were too far apart. By morning, Jake had convinced himself to refuse. He would find Kaya and tell her politely but firmly that he couldn't do what she asked. It was better to say no clearly than to let hope linger. He did his morning chores quickly and headed into town, asking people where he could find the Apache commander. Someone pointed him toward the trading post. Jake walked there with determination, practicing what he would say. But when he arrived, he found Kaya training with her warriors in an open area behind the building. They were practicing hand-to-hand combat, moving with speed and precision that was almost like a dance. Jake stopped and watched despite himself. The warriors were incredibly skilled. Their movements were controlled and purposeful. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was clumsy. Kaya noticed him standing there and called a break. She walked over, barely breathing hard despite the intense exercise. She asked if he had come to give her an answer. Jake nodded and opened his mouth to refuse. But the words caught in his throat. Looking at her up close, sweating and powerful, he couldn't just dismiss her request as crazy. She was serious and sincere. She deserved more than a quick rejection. Instead of refusing, Jake heard himself asking if they could talk more. He said he didn't understand her culture or her reasons well enough. Before he made a decision, he wanted to really comprehend what she was asking for and why. Kaya's expression softened slightly. She said that was fair and wise. She asked if he would be willing to spend time with her over the next few weeks, learning about each other's worlds. Jake agreed, surprising himself. So began the strangest period of Jake's life. Every few days, Kaya would come to his farm and they would talk while he worked. At first, the conversations were awkward and stilted. They came from such different backgrounds that finding common ground seemed impossible. Kaya spoke about honored duty and the warrior's path. Jake spoke about patience, growth, and the farmer's way. They might as well have been speaking different languages, but slowly things began to change. Kaya started asking questions about farming that showed genuine curiosity. She wanted to know why Jake chose to grow certain crops. She asked how he decided when to plant and when to harvest. She inquired about his relationship with the animals. At first, Jake thought she was just being polite. But as time passed, he realized she was truly trying to understand his world. Jake began asking his own questions too. He asked about Apache traditions and how their culture was structured. Kaya explained that her people had formed during Earth's colonial expansion. Different native tribes had united to preserve their heritage while adapting to the stars. They refused to let their cultures die, but they also refused to remain weak. So they became warriors, feared and respected across human space. She told him about the Apache Code of Honor. Promises were sacred and must never be broken. Family bonds were everything. The community came before the individual, but individuals were valued for their unique strengths. Everyone contributed to the whole. There was no room for selfishness or cowardice, but there was also no judgment for different paths. A teacher was as honored as a warrior if they served their people well. Jake found himself fascinated despite his initial resistance. The Apache weren't mindless soldiers like he had assumed. They had a rich culture built on values that weren't so different from his own. They valued community, responsibility, and living with purpose. They just expressed those values through combat, while he expressed them through farming. One afternoon, Kaya asked if she could try working the farm with him. Jake was surprised but handed her a tool for weeding. She knelt in the dirt beside him and started working. At first her movements were too aggressive, yanking at plants and disturbing the soil. Jake gently showed her how to be more careful, pulling weeds without damaging the crops around them. Kaya learned quickly, adjusting her approach and finding the right balance of firmness and delicacy. They worked in silence for a while. Then Kaya said something that stuck with Jake. She said this kind of work required a different kind of strength than combat. Fighting was about explosive power and quick decisions. Farming was about sustained patience and slow wisdom. Both were valid forms of strength. Both were necessary. She admitted that her people had forgotten how to be patient. They solved problems through force because that was what they knew best. Jake looked at her and said that he had forgotten how to be strong. He had chosen farming because it let him avoid conflict. He ran away from Earth to escape violence and difficult choices. He wasn't brave like Kaya thought. He was just hiding. Kaya shook her head firmly. She said that recognizing your limits and choosing a life that honored them wasn't hiding. It was wisdom. Not everyone was meant to be a warrior. The universe needed people who built and grew things, not just people who fought and destroyed. Her words affected Jake more than he wanted to admit. He had spent years thinking of himself as a failure, someone who ran away when he should have stood firm. But Kaya saw it differently. She saw his choice as a different kind of courage. Maybe she was right. Maybe there were many ways to be strong. As the weeks passed, Jake and Kaya developed an unlikely friendship. The colony watched with fascination and concern. Some people thought Jake was making a mistake by spending time with the Apache commander. They worried he would get hurt or manipulated. Others thought it was wonderful that the two cultures were finding connection. Ben was in the second group. He encouraged Jake to keep learning and growing. During one of their conversations, Jake asked Kaya about her past. What had made her become a warrior? Kaya was quiet for a long time before answering. She said she had lost her entire family in a raid when she was young. Pirates had attacked their colony while most of the warriors were away. Her parents and younger brother were killed. Kaya survived only because she hid in a closet while the violence happened around her. After that, she dedicated her life to becoming strong enough to protect others. She trained harder than anyone else. She accepted every dangerous mission. She built a reputation as one of the Apache Nation's finest commanders. But in doing so, she had lost touch with softer emotions. She no longer knew how to simply exist in peace. She only knew how to fight and lead and protect. She was afraid that if she had children, she would raise them to be as hardened as she was. That's why she needed someone like Jake, someone who remembered how to be gentle. Jake felt his heart ache listening to her story. He realized that Kaya's strength came from deep pain, just like his caution came from deep fear. They were both shaped by trauma, just in opposite directions. He had run from violence while she had run toward it. Neither choice was wrong. They were just different responses to a harsh universe. He told her about his own past. He had grown up in a military family on Earth. His father was a soldier and expected Jake to follow the same path. But Jake hated everything about military life. The shouting, the violence, the constant preparation for war. He tried to please his father but failed every test. Eventually, he was given an ultimatum. Join the military or leave the family. Jake chose to leave. He had never spoken to his father again. Kaya listened without judgment. She asked if he regretted his choice. Jake thought about it honestly and said no. He regretted the pain it caused, but not the decision itself. He would have been miserable and useless as a soldier. Finding his way to New Terra and becoming a farmer had saved his life in a very real way. Kaya nodded in understanding. She said both of them had found their true paths through suffering. Now perhaps they could help each other find balance. The conversation marked a turning point. Jake realized that Kaya wasn't trying to change him or make him into something he wasn't. She genuinely valued his differences. And Jake began to see that warriors weren't all the same. Kaya was complicated and thoughtful, carrying her own wounds and questions. He still wasn't sure about having a child together. That decision felt enormous and terrifying, but he was no longer certain his answer would be no. Jake spent 3 weeks recovering from his wounds. The doctor said he was lucky. The energy blasts could have killed him easily, but they had missed vital organs and major blood vessels. He would have scars and some lingering pain, but he would heal completely given time. Physical therapy was painful and frustrating, but Jake worked at it with the same patience he brought to farming. Slowly, his strength returned and he learned to walk without limping. During his recovery, Jake had a lot of time to think. The battle had changed something fundamental in him. He wasn't a different person exactly. He was still cautious and preferred peace to conflict. But he no longer saw those qualities as weaknesses or failures. He had proven to himself that when it truly mattered, he could face his fears and act. That knowledge settled into his bones and gave him a quiet confidence he had never possessed before. Kaya visited every day without fail. Sometimes they talked about serious things. Other times they just sat together in comfortable silence. Their bond had deepened through the shared trauma of battle. They had seen each other at their most vulnerable and most courageous. That created a connection stronger than romance or simple friendship. They had become partners in a profound way, two people who understood each other's souls. One afternoon, Kaya arrived at the medical center with a serious expression. She sat down and told Jake there was something they needed to discuss. The Apache leadership had reviewed what happened during the raid. They were impressed by how Jake had organized the colonist defense and fought despite his injuries. They wanted to honor him formally with an Apache commendation for valor. It was rare for outsiders to receive such recognition. Kaya wanted to know if Jake would accept. Jake felt overwhelmed by the idea. He said he didn't deserve special recognition. He had just done what needed doing. Kaya smiled and said that was exactly why he deserved it. People who sought glory rarely earned it. Those who acted from duty and compassion without expecting reward were the ones truly worthy of honor. Jake thought about it and finally agreed. If accepting the commendation would make Kaya and her people happy, he would do it. But he didn't want a big ceremony. Something small and quiet would be better. Kaya said she would arrange that. Then her expression became even more serious. She said there was something else they needed to talk about. Their agreement to have a child together. With everything that had happened, they hadn't discussed the practical details. Kaya wanted to make sure Jake still wanted to proceed. After facing death and violence, she would understand if he had changed his mind. There would be no judgment or disappointment if he chose to step back. Jake looked at Kaya for a long moment. He thought about everything they had been through together. The awkward first conversations, the slow building of trust and understanding, the shared work in fields and gardens, the terror of battle and the relief of survival. He thought about how Kaya had changed him and how he had apparently changed her. He thought about the future and what kind of world they were building. He told Kaya that he hadn't changed his mind. In fact, the battle had made him more certain. He had seen how fragile life was and how quickly it could be lost. If he had died during the raid, he would have left nothing behind. No family, no legacy, just a farm that someone else would take over. The idea of creating new life with Kaya, of leaving something positive in the universe, felt more important than ever. He wanted to do this. He wanted their child to exist and carry forward the best parts of both of them. Kaya's eyes became suspiciously bright, and she blinked several times. She reached out and took Jake's hand. She said she was honored and grateful. She promised again that she would make sure their child knew their father and his values. The child would learn both Apache ways and human farming traditions. They would be raised to appreciate peace and to fight only when necessary. They would understand that strength came in many forms and all of them had value. They talked for hours about practical arrangements. Jake would remain on his farm while Kaya continued her duties with the Apache fleet. But she would visit New Terra regularly and stay for extended periods. When the child was old enough, they would spend time in both worlds. Jake would teach farming and animal care. Kaya would teach Apache history and warrior skills. The child would choose their own path eventually, but they would have the foundation to be anything they wanted. Several months passed. Jake returned to full health and went back to working his farm. Life in the colony slowly returned to normal, though everyone was changed by what had happened. The colonists were no longer quite so naive about the universe's dangers. They had learned that peace required vigilance and sometimes courage. But they hadn't become warriors or given up their values. They remained committed to building a society based on creation rather than destruction. The Apache and the colonists developed a stronger relationship. Warriors learned farming techniques from the colonists. Colonists learned basic defense strategies from the warriors. There was mutual respect and genuine friendship growing between the two cultures. The raid had been terrible, but it had brought people together in unexpected ways. Jake and Kaya's relationship continued to deepen. They still came from different worlds and had different perspectives on many things, but they had learned to value those differences rather than seeing them as obstacles. Kaya spent more time on New Terra, sometimes staying for weeks at a stretch. She continued working on her garden and learning from Jake about sustainable farming. Jake began learning some Apache language and traditions from Kaya. They taught each other and grew together. One evening, they stood together outside Jake's farmhouse watching the sunset. The sky was painted in brilliant colors and the air smelled of growing things. Kaya said she had received news that day. She was pregnant. Their child would be born in about 8 months. Jake felt a wave of emotion so powerful he couldn't speak. Joy and terror and wonder all mixed together. Kaya watched his face and asked if he was all right. Jake nodded and managed to find his voice. He said he was scared but also happier than he had been in years. This was real now. There would be a child who was part of both of them. A person who would carry their combined legacy into the future. The responsibility felt enormous but also right. Kaya put her arm around his shoulders and pulled him close. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out one by one. The months that followed were busy and strange. Jake prepared his farmhouse to accommodate a child. He built a crib with his own hands, working carefully to make it strong and safe. He planted a special section of garden with flowers and soft grass where a small child could play. The preparations made everything feel more real and immediate. Kaya spent more time at the farm as her pregnancy progressed. Jake took care of her with the same gentle attention he gave his animals and plants. He made sure she ate well and rested enough. He listened to her worries and shared his own. They became true partners, supporting each other through the uncertainty and anticipation. The colony rallied around them. People brought gifts for the baby and offered advice. Ben was especially excited about the prospect of a child on the neighboring farm. He had known Jake for years, and seeing him step into this new role filled the old man with pride. Other colonists were fascinated by this union between cultures. It represented hope for a future where different human groups could come together. When the time came, Kaya gave birth to a healthy daughter. She had Kaya's dark hair and eyes but Jake's gentle expression. They named her Maya, a name that worked in both Apache and common human culture. Holding her for the first time, Jake felt terror and love in equal measure. This tiny person depended on him completely. He could fail her in 1,000 ways. But he could also give her everything good he had to offer. Kaya held Maya with the same fierce protectiveness she brought to battle. But there was also tenderness in her face that Jake had never seen before. She sang to her daughter in the Apache language, old songs passed down through generations. Jake hummed along, learning the melodies even though he didn't know the words yet. This was their family now, strange and unexpected but real and precious. As Maya grew from infant to toddler, she showed characteristics of both parents. She had Kaya's confidence and curiosity, but also Jake's patience and gentleness. She loved playing in the dirt and examining bugs. She also loved when Kaya told her stories of Apache warriors and heroes. She was becoming her own person, influenced by both parents but ultimately unique. Jake taught Maya about plants and animals as soon as she could walk. He showed her how to be gentle with living things and how to work with nature rather than against it. Maya absorbed these lessons with serious attention. She would sit for long periods watching plants grow or chickens scratching in the dirt. Her patience at such a young age amazed Jake. Maybe she had inherited his contemplative nature. Kaya taught Maya about honor, courage, and standing up for what was right. She told stories of Apache heroes who protected their people. She explained that being strong meant helping those who couldn't help themselves. Maya listened with wide eyes and asked countless questions. When Kaya demonstrated basic defensive moves, Maya tried to copy them with her small body. Her determination and focus showed Kaya's influence clearly. The raiders circled closer, their weapons trained on Jake and Kaya. There were at least 8 of them, scarred and cruel-looking individuals who clearly enjoyed violence. Their leader was a massive man with metal implants covering half his face. He grinned and said something about taking the Apache commander alive. She would fetch a good price as a slave. The others laughed and agreed. They raised their weapons, preparing to shoot to wound rather than kill. Jake's mind went blank with terror. His breath came in short gasps and sweat poured down his face. But even through the fear, he noticed something. The raiders were focused entirely on Kaya. They barely glanced at him. They saw an Apache warrior as a threat, but dismissed the scared farmer holding a plasma cutter. That was their mistake. Jake might be terrified, but he wasn't helpless. And sometimes being underestimated was an advantage. He stepped slightly forward, putting himself more directly between Kaya and the raiders. His movement was small but deliberate. The raider leader glanced at him with amusement. He told Jake to move aside unless he wanted to die first. Jake's voice came out shaky and weak when he spoke. He said he wouldn't move. The raiders laughed harder. This was entertainment for them, a coward pretending to be brave. But Kaya understood what Jake was doing. She shifted her position slightly, ready to take advantage of any opening Jake created. She spoke to him quietly in a voice only he could hear. She told him he didn't have to do this. He had already proven his courage. Jake replied just as quietly that he knew he was going to die, but if his death gave her a chance to survive, it would mean something. Kaya started to argue, but there was no time. The raider leader raised his weapon and told Jake this was his last chance. Move or die. Jake's entire body trembled, but his grip on the plasma cutter tightened. He had spent his whole life running from moments like this. He had built a life around avoiding conflict and danger. But standing here now, he realized something important. Some things were worth facing your fears for. Some people were worth protecting even at the cost of your own safety. This was what Kaya had tried to teach him about courage. It wasn't about not being afraid. It was about acting despite the fear. Jake didn't move aside. He stood firm, positioning himself as a shield. The raider leader's grin faded into annoyance. He shrugged and squeezed his trigger. The weapon fired and Jake felt searing pain in his shoulder as the energy blast hit him. He stumbled but didn't fall. The pain was incredible, worse than anything he had ever experienced. But he stayed on his feet, still standing between Kaya and the raiders. That moment of distraction was all Kaya needed. She moved with lightning speed, her combat training taking over. She struck at the nearest raider, disarming him and using his body as a shield against the others. Her movements were precise and deadly. She fought like a force of nature, giving no quarter and taking no unnecessary risks. But she was still outnumbered and wounded from earlier fighting. She couldn't defeat 8 raiders alone. Jake forced himself to act through the pain. He activated his plasma cutter and swung it wildly at the raiders on his side. His technique was terrible, and his aim was poor. But the searing heat and desperate energy kept them back for precious seconds. He wasn't trying to win a fight. He was just trying to buy time. Every second the raiders focused on him was a second they weren't shooting at Kaya. The raider leader roared in anger and fired again. This blast caught Jake in the leg and he went down hard. His vision blurred and his ears rang. He tried to get back up, but his body wouldn't respond. He could only watch helplessly as raiders closed in on Kaya. She fought magnificently, but she was being overwhelmed. This was the end for both of them. Jake had tried and failed. At least he had tried. Then a sound cut through the chaos, a deep rumbling that grew louder by the second. Jake turned his head and saw the most beautiful sight of his life. Apache shuttles were screaming through the sky, coming in fast and low. The main warship must have returned early. Reinforcements were arriving. The shuttles opened fire on the raider ships still on the ground, destroying them before they could launch. Apache warriors poured out of the landing shuttles, hitting the raiders from behind with devastating force. The battle turned in seconds. Raiders who had been confident and cruel moments ago now scrambled to retreat. But there was nowhere to run. The Apache showed no mercy to those who attacked under their protection. Kaya dispatched the last raider near her and immediately dropped to Jake's side. Her face was tight with concern as she examined his wounds. She called for a medic and applied pressure to his bleeding shoulder. Jake tried to speak, but his voice came out as a weak croak. He said he was sorry for being so stupid. He should have stayed behind the barricades like she told him. Kaya shook her head firmly. She said he had saved her life. His courage had given her the opening she needed to survive until help arrived. Jake wanted to argue that he hadn't been courageous, just terrified and desperate. But the world was starting to fade around the edges. The pain was becoming distant and fuzzy. He heard Kaya shouting for the medic to hurry. He felt her hand gripping his tightly. Then everything went dark and quiet. Jake woke up slowly, fighting through layers of fog and confusion. His body felt heavy and distant, like it belonged to someone else. Gradually awareness returned, and with it came pain. Not the sharp agony from before, but a dull ache that radiated from his shoulder and leg. He opened his eyes and found himself in a clean white room. Medical equipment beeped softly nearby. This was the colony's small medical center. Kaya sat in a chair next to his bed. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and dried blood still on her armor. But she was alive and whole. When she saw Jake wake up, relief washed over her face. She leaned forward and told him to stay still. The doctors had patched up his wounds, but he needed rest. He had lost a lot of blood, and his body needed time to heal. Jake's throat was dry when he tried to speak. Kaya held a cup of water to his lips and helped him drink. He asked how long he had been unconscious. She said 2 days. He had been in and out of awareness while the doctors worked on him. Jake asked about the colony and the battle. Kaya reported that New Terra was safe. The raiders had been defeated or captured. 3 Apache warriors had died in the fighting along with 4 colonists. Many more were wounded, but most would recover. Jake felt sorrow at the losses, but also profound relief that it wasn't worse. He asked Kaya if she was all right. She nodded and said she was fine thanks to him. She explained that his actions had amazed everyone. The timid farmer who never fought had stood against armed raiders to protect others. Word had spread through both the colony and the Apache forces. People were calling him a hero. Jake felt embarrassed and said he wasn't a hero. He had been terrified the entire time. He hadn't known what he was doing. He just couldn't stand by and do nothing. Kaya smiled and said that was exactly what made him brave. Heroes weren't people without fear. Heroes were ordinary people who acted despite their fear when it mattered most. Jake had proven that courage came in many forms. It wasn't just about being the strongest or the fastest. Sometimes courage was simply refusing to abandon those who needed you. Sometimes courage was standing firm when everything inside you screamed to run. Over the next few days, many people came to visit Jake as he recovered. Ben came and sat with him for hours, not saying much but providing solid companionship. Margaret and other colony leaders thanked him for organizing the defense. Even Apache warriors stopped by to show respect. They treated Jake differently now, like he was one of them in spirit if not in training. But the visit that meant the most was when the children came. The 3 kids from the family Jake had thought about during the battle brought him drawings they had made. The pictures showed a stick-figure farmer holding off bad guys with a bright torch. The children said he was the bravest person they knew. Jake felt tears in his eyes looking at those crude drawings. This was why he had stayed and fought. For these children and their future. So they could grow up in a world with a little more peace and safety. Kaya stayed by his side through most of his recovery. They talked about what had happened and what it meant. Jake admitted that something had changed in him during the battle. He had always thought of himself as a coward, someone who ran from challenges. But facing death had taught him the difference between caution and cowardice. Being careful and avoiding unnecessary risks was wisdom. Running away when people needed you was cowardice. He had finally learned to tell the two apart. Kaya said she had learned something too. She had always believed that warriors were strong and farmers were weak. But watching Jake stand against impossible odds with shaking hands and a terrified face had shown her a different truth. There were many kinds of strength. The strength to nurture life was as valuable as the strength to end it. The strength to choose peace was as important as the strength to wage war. She had been right to choose Jake. His gentleness didn't make him weak. It made him balanced.